Hi, and welcome into Sociology 1. Now, in this chapter, much of our knowledge, when you think about this, much of our knowledge is based on tradition. The handing down of statements, beliefs, and customs from one generation to the next. And that's not a critique. It's just, how we generally get to know things is through our families, through the news, through the social media. It's just basically handing down information based on tradition. But there's another source of knowledge, and that's authority. A socially accepted source of information that includes experts, parents, government officials, police, judges, religious leaders. Knowledge based on tradition and authority simplify our life because it provides us with basic rules about socially and legally acceptable behavior. The information can be misleading or wrong, however. Suppose a 2-year-old throws a temper tantrum at a family barbecue. One adult might make a comment like, "What that kid needs is a good smack on the behind." Someone else might reply in disagreement saying, "Well, all kids go through, this stage. Just ignore it." So who's right? To answer this and other questions, sociologists rely on research methods, organized and systematic procedures to gain knowledge about a particular topic. Much research shows, for example, that neither ignoring nor inflicting physical punishment like spanking stops a toddler's bad behavior. Instead, most young children's misbehavior can be curbed by having simple rules, being consistent in disciplining misbehavior, praising good behavior, and setting a good example. In contrast to tradition and authority, sociological research is important for our everyday life for several reasons, including counteracting misinformation, exposing myths, helping to explain why people behave as they do, impacts the social policy, and sharpens our critical thinking skills. So let's find out more about sociological research and how it might help us do these things. As I just mentioned, there are many ways of knowing: personal experience, tradition, authority, religion, science. However, it's science that has some fundamental ways to address differences and gain understanding that personal experience, authority, tradition, and religion have difficulty doing. So let's review. Science is empirical. Knowledge is best gained by direct, systematic observation. So empirical is just referring to it's not biased in any way. Scientific knowledge, number 2, is systemic and public. If it's not made public or if it's not verified, it's not accepted. And so having a systematic, which means there's a routine way of doing things, and once you've done your research, you make them public so others can replicate that study and see if it holds water. 3, science has a built-in mechanism for self-correction by creating a hypothesis and then testing them. Hypotheses are tentative statements on the relationship between 2 or more concepts or variables. So it's not bringing in a lot of extraneous things. It's just comparing or seeing what the relationship between 2 concepts or variables. 4, science is objective to ensure that scientists' bias and values do not affect the research. If I really want something to occur and I build my experiment but don't protect against my bias, then chances are if I really want something to occur, I can see that occurring in my research and can make it happen. Empirical studies fall into 2 general categories. Descriptive studies attempt to describe social realities and provide facts about some groups, practices, or events. Explanatory studies attempt to explain the relationship and provide information on why certain events do or do not occur. Now, in either category, theory and research form a continuous cycle. which encompass both deductive approach, which begins with a theory and then it's tested, and the inductive approach, which begins with data whose analysis then generates a theory. So I've mentioned, and let's touch on, sociological research as a process. Now there's two forms of processes. One is quantitative. Now quantitative is an objective study of data that has been measured that can be measured numerically. So you must be able to see and hear it. It needs to be countable. That's what it means by quantitative, is numerically measured. Data, or how many of a, you can be doing things like how many of a certain age, race, sex, education, income. And in the quantitative, it controls for bias because either it's there or it's not. It's numbers. Now the alternative is qualitative research. This is an interpretive description where you're using words, discovery to underlie meanings and patterns of social relationships. Interpretive description is words from interviews, observations, surveys, and questionnaires. So we get this information and then it's open for us to interpret it. Now, quantitative research model, where we'll look at first, it selects and defines the research problem, considers personal experience and social issues, and then asks questions. It reviews previous research and has, what's been done in the past, and that research past, that literature search, will assist in the narrowing of topics. 3, it formulates a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that tentative statement of the relationship between two or more concepts and variables. Now, a variable is any concept with measurable traits or characteristics that vary from one person, time, situation, or society to another. The independent variable, because there's two different kinds of variables, independent and dependent. The independent variable is the variable that is presumed to cause or to determine the dependent variable. So it's the thing you're going to change, or you're going to observe if that change affects the dependent variable. The dependent variable is a variable that is assumed to depend on or be caused by the independent variable. So if you're doing research on one group of people tend to, how do people handle stress? And so you've got handle stress successfully. So you have one group that's going to be your control group that you're going to say, you guys do as you always did. The experimental group will have an independent variable. We're going to add meditation. That's the independent variable. We think it's going to impact your stress level, the dependent variable. And then there's an operational definition. And this becomes very important because it's asking us to take the abstract thought of, stress or, a social entity and say, well, we got to put this into terms that can be observed and counted. Stress in and of itself isn't something that can be counted and observed. You have to ask yourself, well, what can we measure out of stress? Well, there's heart rate, respiration. So there's some things that we can see and can measure and therefore can count. The fourth stage is to develop a research design. Whether choosing experiments, survey research, field research, or secondary analysis of data, researchers must evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of each and decide which one is best for this particular study. 5 is collect and analyze the data. Now there's two things that are important when it comes to collecting and analyzing data. One is called validity, the other is reliability. For validity, this is a measure of the extent to which the study or the research instrument accurately measures what it's supposed to measure. Now that's important. Let's say you're on a diet and you're using weigh scales to measure your weight. Well, weigh scales don't measure intelligence, they don't measure creativity, they don't measure communication skills. So for a tool in collecting data and evaluating is valid, it needs to be able to do what it's supposed to do, and only that. Reliability is the extent to which a study or a research instrument yields consistent results. So we'll use the same analogy. You are trying to lose weight, so you use weigh scales. You want to know that if you jump on the weigh scales in the morning and you weigh a certain weight, and 5 minutes later you go jump on the scales again, you've done nothing differently but just stand there and wait 5 minutes, it should weigh the same. So it would be disappointing if every time you stood on the weigh scale that it made some random sampling of weight. It only weighed your arm, it weighed your whole body, it only weighed your head. So sometimes we'd be very disappointed if it wasn't very reliable. So validity, it measures what it's supposed to. Reliability, it measures reliably that it does it so it yields consistent results. And then last, you draw conclusions. Well, number 6, you draw conclusions and report the findings. Now that's important. After analyzing the data, researchers first draw conclusions that relate the data to the hypothesis. Then they report the findings, which allows for replication. You must be able to report publicly your research so that others can replicate. Replication is the repetition of the investigation in substantially the same way. And see if you get results that resemble that from the first survey. So you might do a different population, you might do it in a different geography, in a different area, but you will design it in the same way and see what results you get. Now, qualitative research model, well, although the same underlying logic is involved in both quantitative and qualitative sociological research, the styles of these two models are very different. Qualitative research is more likely to be used where the research question does not easily lend itself to numbers and statistical methods. And that's quantitative is about numbers and counting seen and heard things. Qualitative, you may not be able, it looks at all the other things. So first, researchers begin with a general rather than a detailed plan because it's a big area. Researchers have to decide when the literature review and theory application should take place, and 3, the study yields a detailed view of the topic, fewer cases, possibly one, and many variables. So the research methods. How do sociologists decide which research method to be used, and how and why are some approaches better than others? So research methods, these are specific strategies or techniques for conducting research, and we're going to review the methods. So please review the strengths and weaknesses of each that you'll see in your textbook, and that's what will help you decide which it needs to be used for their particular topic focuses. So the types of research methods, we'll start with experiments. An experiment is a carefully designed situation in which the researcher studies the impact of certain variables on subjects' attitudes or behaviors. Now, in an experiment, there are 2 primary groups. There are experimental group and control group. The experimental group contains subjects who are exposed to an independent variable, the thing that is thought to cause or will impact the dependent variable. The control group, that contains the subjects who are not exposed to the independent variable. The simplest experimental design, all subjects are pre-tested, that is that they are measured in terms of the dependent variable. And 2, subjects in the experimental group are exposed to the stimulus, the independent variable. All subjects are post-tested, remeasured, in terms of the dependent variable. So see the example in your textbook. On page 36, you'll see, would you help another person? Another example of famous experiments like Milgram's and Ausch's and conformity experiments and Zimbardo's prison experiments are common examples of sociological research with varying degrees of ethics issues associated with those ones I mentioned. Now, the second form is what's known as surveys. Survey research is the method perhaps most often associated with sociology. Research methods in which a number of respondents are asked identical questions through a systematic questionnaire or interview. Now, what's important about that is that just really means that the interviewee or interviewer has to say Ask the questions in the same tone of voice, in the same cadence, and the same words, and no explanations. Everybody gets the same questionnaire given in the same way. Now, respondents, these are the people who provide data for analysis through interviews and questionnaires. Survey research involves some type of sampling. Now, that's important for all experiments too. If you're using people, is that you select your sample, the participants in your survey or your experiment, from a population. In research study, those persons would make up a population about whom we want to be able to draw conclusions. If I want to do a research on college students and their success rate going through a certain program, then my population are those college students in that program. That's it. I don't take people who are not in college and not in that program. That's my population. From that, I can draw my sample. The sample are the people who are selected from the population. So if there's 500 students in a program and I'm selecting 70, I select them from that program, from that population, and that's my sample. Now, what's important when I select a sample is that it's representative sample, a sample that has essentially the same characteristics of the total population. So if in the total population, half of the program is women and half the program is men, and then there's other demographics, age, race, sexuality, that whatever those percentages are, they hold true in the representative sample. So that my representative sample that I'm going to study resembles the population that I'm studying. And then lastly, within that population, I do a random sample. I can't cherry pick only those people that I want in my study. Random sample, persons are selected by chance or randomly. There can't be any pre-selective criteria. Third type of research is field research. And this is the study of social life in the natural setting, observing and interviewing people where they live, where they work, and where they play. A fuller understanding can be developed through these types of observations. They're face-to-face discussions and participations in events. Now, these two approaches to observation, complete observation and participant observation. Now, the complete observation, the research systematically observes a social process but does not take part. So in some daycare settings that are used for research, they have a two-way glass, so the researcher can't be seen, but they can make observations. Or you're observing from a distance people that are engaged in some activity, but you're not engaged in participating with them. As you would expect, participant observation, researchers collect information while participating in the life of people. It's also referred to as ethnography. Observational research can take place just about anywhere. Now, oftentimes there will be interviews involved in doing some of this research. So the most favorable form of interview is what's known as an unstructured interview. An extended, open-ended interaction between an interviewer and an interviewee. Now, when it says open-ended, it means that you're not asking questions that require a yes and no answer. That's a closed question or closed interaction. Open-ended means you're saying, for example, what flavor of ice cream do you like? Not asking a very discreet yes or no, like, do you like vanilla? Yes or no. I might be saying instead, what kind of ice cream do you like? And now I've opened it up and you have to fill in the blank yourself. Secondary analysis of existing data uses existing material analysis of data originally collected by others. It's unobtrusive, but it's a good source. Now, some of those sources will include data banks, books, magazines, newspapers, radios, television programs, personal documents, internet sites. In this particular area, we use the term to describe huge databases, and these are huge. They require specialized computers to be able to monitor them, but they are often referred to as big data. And that's been taking a huge place in society over the last maybe 10 years, certainly more actively used in the last 5. In order to make sense of all this data, they will use triangulation. And triangulation uses several different research methods, data sources, investigators, and other theoretical perspectives in the same study. Each method has its own strengths and weaknesses, so many sociologists believe that it's the best way to combine multiple methods in a given study. Now we're going to touch on feminist research methods because they take a decidedly different approach. Feminist social scientists have been critical of the traditional sociological research methodologies. Much of the research has limitations, including endocentricity. Check your textbook for that. And sexist language or concepts. Research methods that are biased in favor of men bring into question the research methodology. Research in which results that focus on members of one sex and used to support conclusions about both sexes. That could be problematic, obviously. The way in which the feminists use research methods is different. One, it's women-centered. Two, the goals are to help women improve their situation and to give voice to women. And three, the researcher is seen as central to the research process rather than one that is an objective researcher. So it's a decidedly different approach, but it's the feminist approach. Critical research strategies dispute the neutrality of scientific approach. Some researchers feel that this neutral stance implicates the researchers in the dominant power structure that creates and maintains injustice. Critical research strategies are rooted in the concern for social justice. Oppositional research places themselves on the side of the marginalized and critique structures that marginalize them. So if I'm looking at homelessness, as a researcher, I would put myself in a position near where homelessness occurs and critique the structures that put them in that situation. So I would look at, so what are the structures and situations and concepts and people that interfere and keep people in a homeless manner? Radical, this type of research that is radical, researchers try to get at the root of the dominance and explore the interconnections of, for example, capitalism. And then there is subversive. Researchers in this instance, they question assumptions in order to open the door to alternative understandings of the social world. So you can see there's a wide variety of research information that gets at information that we would suggest is getting at social facts that help understand the social picture in which we live in. But with all research, sociological, psychological, there are ethic issues to be considered. A long history of the development of guidelines to protect the integrity, the privacy, and honor the people being studied. Sociologists must follow a number of basic ethical standards. Participants must be voluntary. There's no coercing people into research. They either voluntarily join or they voluntarily don't. Secondly, you can't harm participants. And this is where, in some ethical issues with research that was done in the past, it could be argued that some people didn't know they could get out of the research, or two, they may have been harmed, not necessarily physically, but emotionally. Three, respect the rights and confidentiality and anonymity. That's important to check that out. Now check out the examples that are provided in your textbook from the studies that raised questions regarding privacy. The Humphreys research, the Magnotta and the Ogden cases, and in the issues of ethics and big data. You'll find this to be very helpful in understanding why there are ethics in research and how that protects participants and ensures the integrity of the research. Well, I hope this was helpful for you. I hope you found it useful. That is now the end of this particular video, and good luck to you all. Make sure you take your textbook with you and as you watch the videos and make notes as you go. It's going to help you when it comes to test time. Thank you, everybody, and good luck.